When we approach the second principle of Unitarian Universalism, which states, we affirm and promote justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. That's a statement where a lot of people can approach it and go, yeah, that's something agreeable. That's something we would want to see in the world. As with all of the principles, many people can approach them and go, yeah, that sounds good. Why not? Let's go with that. But I like to approach the second principle and read it a little more slowly. And it's not just justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. That's something that we can easily rattle off and go, well done, we thought about it, that's great. But when you read it slowly and let the words sink in and reread it and reinterpret the words again and again, that is where the principle really starts to come alive. And of course, when we start to live it, that's when it really comes alive. But read it a little more slowly, say it a little more slowly. Justice, equity, compassion in human relations. It's not one or the other. It's not your favorite of justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. It's all three in every human relation, every human encounter. Whether it's online at a great distance, anonymous, whether it's your family, your friends, anyone you know. It could be on Facebook, it could be on YouTube or Reddit, it could be the comment section of a news website if you're someone that likes to read that. It can be driving down the road and driving past someone. It could be just sitting outside and someone walks by. Whatever interaction it is, it could be a political rally. It could be someone mad at us for something we didn't do or something we did do. It could be a justice rally where two parties on different sides of an issue are clashing with one another. Whatever it is, as Unitarian Universalists, we're called to bring justice, equity, and compassion to the forefront of those interactions. Now, on a normal day, normal, whatever that means anymore, when our lives haven't been turned upside down by a global pandemic, that is difficult to always center justice, equity, and compassion in human interaction. Now, sometimes we might be afire with passion for justice, a cause for justice. And we get so wrapped up in that cause for justice that we forget to be equitable and we forget to approach it with compassion. Or sometimes we could be so consumed with equity that we forget the obvious cause for justice right in front of us. And compassion can suffer as well. And sometimes we center compassion above all else, a compassion that glazes over the causes for justice and the need for equity, a compassion that says, I just have compassion for you and all will be okay as long as I manifest that by thinking about it. And so what the second principle does is that it calls us to act not just with our minds and our hearts when we do so with compassion, not just with our hands and the elbow grease that's required for the work of justice, not just with equity, which is the way we structure our society and our culture and our churches and every group that we are a part of. It's all three in everything. And so when you add in a global pandemic into that mix, everything changes. When we think of justice, we think of going somewhere and doing something. Well, you're not going anywhere and doing anything. At least I hope you're not. When we think of equity, we think of changing the system. We think of making everything accessible. We think of the gender pay gap, the racial pay gap. We think of all the inequity that our society is facing and currently facing, and the policies and structures that are keeping those things in place. How do you change those things when you can't go anywhere, when you can't advocate, when the government is completely ignoring anything the people are saying? And this was before the pandemic and especially during the pandemic. And how do you hold compassion? Compassion for yourself because you're stuck at home and you might not think you're doing enough. You are doing enough. And if you're overworking, here's permission not to do all of it. The whole world is experiencing systemic, sustained trauma. You can ease up just a bit. But how do you have compassion for yourself when your life has been turned upside down, when you might have lost your job, when there's great uncertainty about losing your job or your family dynamics are changing, whatever it might be, keeping yourself healthy? How do you have compassion for your community when you can interact with your community, not just on Sunday, but all the other activities we used to have here at UUCL and the communities and activities in our communities? How do you have compassion for leaders, our federal government, and other politicians who are making people think it's okay to choose dangerous, unverified actions in their lives? I don't need to tell you what those are. You can turn on the news and there's a new one every day. How do you have that compassion? How do you strive for equity? How do you work for justice? Now, there's no clear answer here, but there is something that we can do. We can still honor our emotions as they are coming up. In all the causes for justice, we should be angry. We should be unsettled. There's a great hymn, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest." Well, we who believe in justice cannot rest. And we need to have that fire of indignation and that fire of commitment. And so I encourage you to express those things. Don't bottle them up, but express them through the lens of the other two elements of this principle. Think of the emotions you're having around causes for justice and consider equity. Consider how your emotions and your passion and this cause for justice is going to affect other human beings. How are you presenting this in an equitable way? How are you presenting this in a way where everyone can approach it, that it's accessible? But also, how are we approaching justice and equity with compassion? And how are we approaching other people's causes for justice and equity with compassion? We might read something or we might hear something said that we don't agree with, and we might think someone's being too angry or too full of indignation and calling people out too strongly. How are we approaching that person, someone we might love dearly as a friend or family member, or someone we might not know at all, through the lens of compassion, through the lens of understanding what they might be going through? So these are just a few things that we can consider here in this time with our second principle. I look forward to exploring our third principle next week with you. Blessed be. Amen.